third topic, in the section on the bowls. So this is the third topic, and we're kind of going to be focusing on the sanctuary vision in Revelation chapter 15. But it's going to take us outside of chapter 15 into one of the big themes of Revelation, which is the theme of the Exodus. And we'll see that as we move through. Your notes are fairly comprehensive. As you see, it is chapter T, it's topic T, and we're at number 28 in our series. So that's that one there. All right, we got it? Yeah. Okay. Now, if you remember, somebody asked a question last week, and it was a really good one, and thinking about it during the week, I thought I'd better make a comment. Remember last week we took the vision of chapter 15 through to 18, and we kind of tried to coordinate the parts of it. And somebody raised a question about the timing, because they were looking at the chapter and saying, well, you've got point A, point B, and point C, they should follow. Well, this is what I want to say, and thank you for that question, because it's a point we need to clarify, and that is, when you see "and I saw" in Revelation, it introduces a new aspect of the vision, or a new vision. We're clear on that, aren't we? Yeah? And then you go on and say, "then I saw," and so this one follows this. There's a sequence in the visions. What he's doing is he's putting the visions into the sequence in which he saw them. Are we clear on that? He's not coordinating the content, but just those snapshots. This is the order I saw them in. And so that's why last week we were breaking them down, saying, well, how does number 1 relate to number 3? And how does that relate to number 2, you see? So we're clear on that, huh? Okay, thank you. That was a good question, because that's a good point that needs to be made right. I should have made that right at the beginning, because it would have avoided a bit of confusion. So we take each one in the order John saw it, was shown it, but we look at the contents and say, well, how does the contents of the first vision relate to the second and relate to the third? So that's the point that I just wanted to basically to clarify. Now, you remember in Revelation chapter 15, and this is on your notes on your first page, in Revelation chapter 15, we really saw two main groups. Two groups. If you look at verse 1, it introduces 7 angels. We're clear on that? And they've got the 7 last plagues in which the wrath of God is finished. But then in verse 2 to 4, he jumps across and he sees a second group, that is, those who have conquered the beast, its image, and the number of its name. And so in the second vision, he sees the conquerors, the overcomers. This is a major theme of Revelation, remember? Promises to the overcomers in the letters. In chapter 12, you've got the way they overcame. They overcame by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. And right at the end, to him who overcomes, you've got the new heavens and the new earth opening up. And so that's what we've got in that second vision. And then in the third snapshot that John sees, that's in verses 5 to 8, he returns to the 7 angels. And he sees them coming out of the sanctuary. Remember this? They give them bowls, and then the sanctuary fills with smoke, and no man can enter until the 7 bowls, or the wrath of God, has been completed. And so we've got those 3. It's quite interesting to note, because the 7 angels here and here form a frame that encloses the vision of the conquerors, yeah? And so we really want to understand what's the relationship between the angels and the conquerors. That's the point that we basically want to follow. So that's in your first notes. The legitimate question to ask is, how do the two groups interrelate? What's the relationship between the angels and what's the relationship between the 144,000? Or are they totally disconnected? So by the time we end up today, I hope that question's clear. We'll be able to see the importance of the relationship of these to these ones. So that's basically where we are going. So 2 points I want to make right at the beginning. This is in your notes on page 1. Point A. The first thing is we want to remember the context of the bowl section, because we're in the bowl section now, and the bowl section is chapter 15 through to chapter 18. Okay, so we've got the bowl section, and we want to make sure that we are clear on the context of it. Now, yeah, okay, we might need another set of notes. Can I borrow one of those ones? I gave you the extra ones. Yeah, thanks. All right. Are we okay? Everyone's got a set? Yeah. You got a set, Tina? Okay. Now, the first thing is the context of chapter 15 to 18. Remember, chapter 15 to 18 follows chapter 12 to 14. Yeah? Got that? So this comes after chapter 12 to 14. Now, what are chapter 12 to 14? What does it deal with? This is just revision. What does chapter 12 to 14 in Revelation? And come on, we spent weeks doing this. It's a commentary on the trumpet. So this is part of the trumpet section. It's part of the trumpet section. That's good. What's its content? What are the trumpets? Give me one word that the trumpets are all about, or two words. No. Oh, yes, that's an aspect of it, but the real focus is when you relate it to Matthew chapter 24, what section does it cover? Tribulation. So this is the tribulation time of Matthew 24, yes? And the tribulation time in chapter 12 to 14 is given structure. Tribulation time in Matthew, one big period, but when we come into Revelation chapter 12 and 13, we find two periods of persecution. Remember this? Followed by chapter 13, two persecutors. And then when you put chapter 14 with chapter 13, we get those two great messages that go out worldwide. One is worship the beast and his image or die, and the other one is fear God, give glory to him, for the hour of his judgments come. Worship him who created the heavens and the earth, or you're going to drink of the wine of God's wrath. And so this is tribulation time, and chapter 15 to 18 are following on from the tribulation time. Yes? And then when we come into chapter 19 to 22, beyond it, we get into that passage which starts with the second coming and it ends up with the new heavens and the new earth. So you've got to keep in mind these big perspectives all the time. Are we all right on this? Okay. And so we're in the bridging between tribulation. Are we clear on this? The troubled time for God's church. And the new heavens and the deliverance and the new heavens and the new earth section. So this is tribulation time, and 19 to 22 is the new heavens and the new earth section. And so we're in 15 to 18, which bridges. between the two. In fact, if you keep this in mind, what you're going to find is chapter 12 to 14, tribulation time, that takes us up to the borders of the close of probation in chapter 15 verse 8. It doesn't mention it, but it just takes us up to the borders. So chapter 12 to 14 is taking us up to that point. It's dealing with that material. So if you want to know what's going to take place before the close of probation, go to chapter 12 to 14 and it will tell you. There'll be two great periods of persecution, and right at the end of time there'll be a group with a message that opposes the message of Babylon the Great. And so that's going to be final great conflict, the war on the remnant. We okay on that? And then when we come into chapter 19, particularly verse 11 following, we're second coming. We got that? So this section, tribulation, is dealing with that time leading up to the close of probation. And the chapter 19 to 22 is dealing from the second coming to the new earth, the events that are going to take place. And so what we got here in the section on the bowls, that's the trumpets. This is the 7 last visions. What we've got in here is the bowls, the bridge between tribulation and the new heavens and the new earth. So that's a good perspective just to keep in mind when you're dealing with Revelation. Big picture stuff. Any questions on that? Okay. So if you want to know, hey, what's going to happen after probation closes, before the second coming? Where are you going to go? Basically the bowl section. Now there's material here that looks back and material that looks forward, but that's the main thrust of it, the bowl section. And if someone says to you, well, what's going to happen after the second coming? You know where to go. Revelation chapter 19 through to chapter 22 verse 5. So that's really, we're in that period which bridges between these events and the new heavens and new earth, tribulation and the new heavens and the new earth. So that's the first point I want you to keep in mind. That's not in your notes, but you can remember that or make a sketch or something later. Now the second point, point B, is the central verses. That's here, the section that deals with the conquerors, those who've overcome. That second vision finds its focus in the redeemed. And they're singing the song of Moses and of the Lamb by a Red Sea. And it's a Red Sea because it is a sea mingled with fire. Gives it a red colour. Now, straight away, that takes your mind somewhere. It takes it back to the Exodus, where Moses sang the song of deliverance in Exodus 15 after the plagues had fallen on Egypt, and the children of Israel had seen the armies of Egypt drowned in the waters, and now they're standing on the other side looking back over the waters to Egypt. Waters always separate. Did you know that in Revelation? They always separate. Here you've got the Red Sea, and what does it do? It separates the Israelites from what they were to what they now are. And what about the River Jordan? Remember at the end of the wilderness wanderings? Mm-hmm. It separates them from what they were in the wilderness to what they are in the new land. And what does baptism do? Exactly, that's exactly what it should do. It should be that point, that clear point that separates us from the old life and plants us in the new. Not just joining a church and knowing its doctrines, but the deep fundamental issue of baptism is separation. Anyway, we're not talking about baptism this afternoon, much as I'd like to. So what we're going to do now is we're going to consider the exodus of national Israel from Egypt. You got that? So what we're going to do in the light of this, with its imagery of the Red Sea and the Song of Moses, we're going to start looking at national Egypt and its exodus from national Israel, national Israel. I'll call it NI here, national Israel, and its exodus from Egypt. I should do it the other way round, really. I should put Egypt, and then there's the Exodus, and then you've got national Israel redeemed and delivered on the other side. So that's the picture. We're going to be looking at national Israel and its Exodus, and we're going to be seeing in this material an allusion or allusions to spiritual Israel and its exodus from Babylon. So that's what we're going to do. And I think you'll find it's something that makes the story of Revelation, because sometimes what we do when we're studying, we get stuck in a little verse and we don't see the big flow of the ideas that occur in the book. And so what we're going to do today is start to look at the big flow. Now, I've got a PowerPoint, and the verses will just follow. So if you want to put notes on, against on your sheet against the passages, feel free. Now, notice Exodus chapter 1. This is national Israel, yeah? The 12 tribes. This is history. This is real. And so is the second one we'll be looking at. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us." And so Israel in Egypt was expanding. It was growing from one family, really, the family of Jacob and his sons, and it was starting to multiply, and as the generations went by, years after years after years, they had kids after kids after kids after kids, and so the tribes of Israel were really developing and growing. And so this is what Pharaoh said, "Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us." And so Pharaoh is concerned about the threat that Israel is offering to his power. We okay on that? All right. And escape from the land. And then it goes on in verses 11, 13b. "Therefore," this is what the Egyptians did, "they set taskmasters over them to what? To afflict them with heavy burdens." Oh, suffer the tribes in Egypt. "So they ruthlessly," and that's a pretty strong word too in English, isn't it? Ruthless is rough and hard. "Ruthlessly made the children of Israel work as slaves." Work as slaves. "And made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field." And so what's happened to the children of Israel? They've become slaves. They've entered into, I'm going to just say it, they've entered into affliction. They're in a tribulation time. Oh, that starts to ring a bell, does it? They're in a tribulation time. And so for Israel, the tribes, tribulation time. In their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. So that's national Israel. And for Israel commenced a time of tribulation. And in chapter 1:12, notice this, the more they were oppressed, the more they what? Wow. So tribulation time for the children of Israel was a time for expansion in numbers, and not only numbers, but also expansion abroad. And so now they're starting to spread from Goshen and starting to go throughout the whole land of Egypt. During what time? The oppression time, tribulation time. So there's two nice points that you're getting out of national Israel. Okay, this is all, should be in your notes. For Israel, the time of tribulation was a time of great growth. The nation increased in population. That's the Israelites increased in population. And they spread throughout Egypt. Now we move on to the next point. Notice this. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned. So here they are, under oppression, in tribulation, being afflicted. And they're groaning aloud because of their slavery. And they begin to what? Cry out for help. They cry out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came where? It came up to God. You got that? Mm-hmm. And so now they're crying to God in the midst of their tribulation for help. They're wanting deliverance from the suffering and the hardness of their lives. We're going to see this in a few moments in Revelation. All those points we'll see in Revelation.
So we're talking about two tribulations.
No, we're talking about this is a tribulation for who? For national Israel.
Oh, right.
For the tribes in Egypt. Anything that comes out of Exodus has got to do with national Israel.
And that's exactly what's going to happen these days.
That's what we're going to see. We're going to see it in Revelation in a minute. We're going to apply it. And what did God do? He heard their groaning and remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So I put different colors in because there's 3 points there. You got that?
Yeah.
The 3 points. The people in Israel are groaning. They're in a terrible tribulation time. They're suffering. And they're crying out to God for help. And then the next point is the cry goes up and God hears. And then God remembers his covenant. Thank God he remembers his covenant. God saw the children of Israel and God knew. He knew what they were going through. He knew the pain in their hearts and the suffering that they were feeling. Hey, that's the kind of God we worship, huh? He knows the struggles and the hard times that we are going through. And when we cry out, don't we cry out to God really in our times of trouble? Isn't that when we really cry out to God? When everything's peaceful and running smooth, we run smooth. But real prayer comes when the pressure's on. Okay, so I've just got it down. Tribulation time for Israel in Egypt. Affliction increases. The people cry out to God for deliverance, and God hears and responds. And so here's the paradigm. In tribulation, the Israelites are praying, and God's listening. And we'll see God's going to respond. All right. Prayer is central to God's response. And you're going to find in a few moments, I think, that how important prayer is in Revelation. Absolutely important in Revelation. Now, I want to jump on to spiritual Israel. Yes, so we're going to Revelation now, and we're going to look and see those same points coming through in Revelation chapter 6, 9 to 11, which is the fifth seal. And you remember the fifth seal? Souls under the altar? Yeah? And when we went behind it, we found, fifth seal, tribulation, Matthew 24, 9 to 28. That's the verses that it's covering. So this is talking about tribulation time, yeah? And we went further in those earlier chapters, and we looked and we saw that this is expanded in the trumpet section. We saw that already. So that's something that I hope's in your mind clear, because this is where we're just referring to what we've done before. We're pulling it out. Okay. And so he opened the fifth seal. He saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness they had borne. And so this is tribulation time, beginning for spiritual Israel. We okay on that? Okay. So just like national Israel went through tribulation in Egypt, so God's people are going to go through tribulation. There's going to be a tribulation time for spiritual Israel. And that tribulation time goes from the first persecution right through the second persecution, Revelation 12 and chapter 13. We're clear on this? That's all in Revelation. Okay. They're slain for their loyalty to their God. So that's those spiritual Israels. Now, notice this next verse, verse 9 or verse 10. What did they do when they were suffering? They cried out with a loud voice. What did children of Israel do in tribulation? They cried out to God. So see, the parallels are all there. Isn't it amazing? We're getting now to the story that's flowing through Revelation. Okay, they cried out with a loud voice, and this is what they cried out. O sovereign Lord, holy and true, God who is the ruler and the reigner, the one who reigns, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? So that's their cry. It's a cry, it's a prayer, it's a prayer for God to step in and to intervene because they are suffering. They're desperate. Are we okay on this? You're starting to see national Israel at the background of this. Good. That's what I wanted. So in response to tribulation, spiritual Israel does what? It's praying. Right there in Revelation. In tribulation, prayer. That's the point that it's making. All right, now we move on to verse 11. We're still under the fifth seal. Then they were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete, who were to be killed as they had been. So now we're going to find 2 points. God hears and God responds. They're given white robes and he tells them. So God's responding here. We're clear on this? Just like he did for Israel. Tribulation, cry to God. God hears and God responds. And notice this. Until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete, who were to be killed as they had been. Aha. So the first emphasis is on the power of prayer. But the second emphasis is tribulation. This tribulation that God's people are going to go through is going to lead to an increase in numbers. They're going to be growing and expanding during tribulation time. So just as for Israel, the tribulation time in Egypt was a time when they multiplied, they increased, and they expanded, they spread, what's going to happen to the church? Exactly the same. The blood of the saints is the seedbed of the martyrs. That's a saying that I really like. And so the suffering time is a time of great growth for God's church. New believers, that's what it's saying. Because listen, it says, until the number of their fellow servants, and their brothers, so this is talking about numerical numbers, isn't it? It's not just talking about qualitative growth, but it's talking about quantitative expansion of God's church. So the answer's there in the text. And these were to be killed as they themselves have been. So in tribulation, this is what's going to happen to spiritual Israel, God's church. So we should thank God for persecution because it keeps us faithful. It's sometimes in the times of peace that our feet start to wander because we just get a bit lazy with it. Are we okay on this? You seeing the parallels, huh? Okay. the experience of spiritual Israel parallels the experience of, it should be national Israel. Isn't it amazing? Okay, it's how it connects. So tribulation again, prayer, response, and I should also put down here multiplication, growth, expansion of God's kingdom through suffering. So the same theme undergirds the sanctuary vision that introduces, the same theme, these ideas undergird the sanctuary vision that introduces the trumpet section. So we looked at the fifth seal. Now I want to show you in the trumpet section exactly the same themes are coming through. Exactly the same themes. So here's the sanctuary vision. This is all in your notes. I'm sure I've got these texts down for you. Revelation 2:8-6. This is the sanctuary vision that's introducing the tribulation section, the trumpet section of Revelation. Yeah? Okay. I saw 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. And another angel came and stood at the altar with a golden censer. And he was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne. So the trumpet section is elaborating the fifth seal. That's your first point. This is elaborating. But the point I want you to notice here is, where does this other angel stand? He's standing at the altar. Now I'm just going to jump back. I'm sorry I have to do it quickly. I just want to jump back and I want to show you. We'll have to go back too far, I think. No, we'll go back. It's worth it. Yeah, here's the altar here. Under the fifth seal. Same altar. So you're following this? This is the altar. This is the altar of burnt offerings. This is not the golden altar, the altar of prayer, but this is the golden altar. And what is underneath it? Yeah, and what are they doing? And so he's standing, the angel in chapter 8 is standing at exactly the same altar that is presented in the fifth seal as being the one under which the blood of the martyrs is crying out to God for justice and for judgment. You following this? So they're connected. Fifth seal, strongly connected through the altar to the vision in chapter 8, 2-5. We okay? All right. I mean, later on, just take the verses, put them beside, and just look at them. You can use a computer to do this if you've got a computer, or just use scripture. Okay, and so we're going to move quickly back to where we were. Okay. So here's this angel. He's standing at the altar with a golden censer. And what's he given? At that altar of burnt offerings, where the blood of the saints is crying out to God, how long, O God? He collects incense. And what's he going to offer it with? Prayers of the saints. There's a prayer associated with the altar in chapter 5 and chapter 6, fifth seal. What's the prayer of the saints under the fifth seal? How long, O God, holy and true, before you will judge and avenge? So here's God's people suffering, tribulation, and they're crying out to God for intervention. How long? And so this angel comes and he's given incense to offer with the prayers of the saints. And so close connection between the incense that he gets at the altar and the prayers of the saints. And you find exactly the same connection. Just check your notes. You find exactly the same connection. Let me just get to it. It won't be long. Exactly the same connection between, this is on Revelation page 3. You got page 3? Right, up near the top, Revelation 5:8. An angel comes to the altar in 8:2, which is the altar of burnt offerings, the same altar brought to view under the fifth seal. At the altar, the angel is given much incense to be offered with the prayers of the saints, the same connection between incense and prayer has already been established in chapter 5, where it says, "And when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each holding a harp and a golden bowl full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints." And so he's collecting from the altar, he's collecting God's saints, the prayers of God's saints. So we're following this in chapter 8, and he's offering them up to God. So what's the prayer that is going up to God in chapter 8? How long, O God, holy and true, before you'll judge and avenge? And so there's God's people, tribulation, suffering, and the angel in chapter 8 is offering up their prayer. He's taking that incense, and the picture of incense being offered on the altar, his prayers are ascending up to God. And then it goes on and it says, "And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints rose before God from the hand of the angel." And so God's people suffering. In their suffering, they're crying out to God, "How long?" And what's happening? The prayer is rising up into the presence of God himself. And so there we've got the same thought that we had under the 5th seal we've got in the sanctuary vision that introduces the trumpets. We're clear on this? It's all Exodus imagery. It's all the way, it's flowing through the seals and it's flowing through the trumpets. And then the angel took the censer. So here's God's response. The angel, because the prayers come up before God, then the angel goes back to the altar. He takes the censer, he fills it with fire from that altar. And what does he do with it? He throws it to the earth. Here's God's response. "And there were peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake." Wow. And so this is God's response to the prayer. And so exactly the same paradigm. We have tribulation, 5th seal and trumpet section parallel Matthew 24, 9 to 28. As a result of the tribulation, God's people pray and God responds. He hears and God responds. And so this is coming parallel to the experience of national Israel. Censer filled with fire cast to the earth, and what's the result? Trumpet plagues. Because you look at each of those trumpets that's blown, the trumpet blasts, and each of those plagues that comes as a result of the trumpets being blown, the trumpet plagues, they are partial because they only impact on 1/3 of the earth, 1/3 of the sea, and so on and so forth, all the way through, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, because they are God's judgments on those who are persecuting his people, but they mix with mercy, because God's purpose in the plagues is not punishment, but it's repentance. That's what God's working for. So all the way through, even in judgment scenes, we see God's love reaching out to try and reach people until finally we'll see in the bowl section they become unreachable. They've gone beyond that point. And now it's full and it's aimed at destruction. But I'm sure when God pours out his wrath in the bowl plagues, it's with great pain in the heart of God, because who's being destroyed? The ones he loved, because they have rejected him. They have rejected him. So the problem's on their side. So it's not God sitting back coldly and saying, right, now you're going to suffer. That's us. Self-centeredness. You know, kids do something, you warn your kids about something. Look, don't touch the stove, it's hot. And so what does the kid do? He wants to know what hot is. And so he touches, and what does Dad say? I told you so. Next time you'll learn and you'll listen. You see, that's the way we respond as human beings, but not God, because with God, there's empathy and there's pain in his heart as his people suffer. All people suffer. Brings great pain to the heart of God. Okay. Because with the bowls, we're going to see the completion of the wrath of God. Okay, are we clear on this? And so you're starting to see the paradigm, huh? You're starting to see the connection, the pattern and the connection in Revelation. Because it's this pattern and this storyline that really is the important thing, huh? Not getting lost in a little section and wondering what it means, but seeing the big picture flowing through, the drama of Revelation. Now, we're going back to national Israel, okay, for the next step. Exodus now tells the story of Israel being brought where? Out of Egypt. Now notice Exodus 3, 7 and 8. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt. And I've heard their cry. See, same points, huh? They're afflicted. They're crying out to God because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings. And now God's response, what does he say? I've come down, the time's come for deliverance. And when the number of God's people, the fellow servants and the brothers of their souls under the altar have reached completion, that's when God will step in and he'll come down to deliver his church. You following? Yep. Okay, good. Out of the hand of the Egyptians, and he's going to bring them up where? Out of the land, and I should have underlined that, out of the land, so deliverance, Exodus. This is Exodus, isn't it? But it's not finished. He's going to bring them out in order to bring them in. You got this? To bring them into a good and a broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So number one, God sees and hears the prayers of his people who are suffering, and his response is twofold. Number one, bring them out of tribulation. And number two is bring them into a good land. Isn't that beautiful? Now notice this, please. I want you to notice this. This is really important. We've got exactly the same in Revelation. Exactly the same. Because in the trumpets, I just call it TR, in the trumpets, we've got tribulation. In the bowls, chapter 15 to 18, do you know what we've got? We've got God now, he's heard the suffering of his people, and now he's doing this. He says, I've come down to deliver. And so now, in the bowls, we get deliverance, okay, out of, not Egypt, but in Revelation, it's out of Babylon, the great, the persecuting power. But it doesn't finish there, because when we move on to the last visions, second coming, remember second coming? To the new earth. This is where God, who's taken us out of, during the bowls, is going to bring us into the new heavens and the new earth. Isn't that beautiful? So those two sides of God's promise to national Israel, to bring them out, to deliver them, and to bring them in, will find its fulfillment in spiritual Israel, in the church. Because God will bring us out of tribulation and take us into that good land. Isn't that fantastic? Mm-hmm. Now you're getting the big picture stuff in Revelation. You're getting the flow of the whole story in Revelation. All right, bear with me just a few minutes. So Exodus is about to occur. God will bring national Israel out of Egypt into the land of Canaan. And then he says exactly the same here in Exodus 6, 2 to 8. I've heard the groaning of my people, remembered my covenant. I'll bring you out. I will deliver you from slavery. I will redeem you with an outstretched hand. I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God, and you will know I am the Lord your God. So he's going to bring him out by delivering and redeeming them, pulling them to himself. And this is Sinai, where he enters into that relationship. You'll know I am the Lord your God who's brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. And what does he say in verse 8? Into what? Land I swore to give Abraham, Isaac and Jacob.
Hallelujah.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's what Revelation's saying to us. Tribulation time. Hey, when the plagues are falling, you know what we're doing? We're dancing in the mountains amongst the trees. We're dancing because we're praising God, because now we know that God is acting on our behalf to deliver us. Why are some Adventists frightened of the 7 last plagues? No, I'm just asking the question, why are we frightened of them? This is a time for rejoicing. Because now we know the one who's bringing us out is also going to bring us in. The one who takes us out of Babylon in the bowl section is going to bring us into the new heavens and new earth. Wow.
Amen.
This is all tied up in Revelation chapter 15 with that song of Moses and the deliverance of the saints. I'll give it to you for a possession. So twofold aspect of the Exodus for national Israel out of Egypt into the land, for spiritual Israel out of Babylon the Great, bowl section, into the new earth, last visions. So there it is. It's all parallel. It's all allusions back to that great story of deliverance, which God did at the beginning with national Israel, and says the same will happen at the end of time with my people. Fantastic. And so here you've got a diagram, I think. Is that correct? Yeah. You've got diagram national Israel, book of Exodus, deliverance out of Egypt and into the land of Canaan. So we're just picturing what we've already said. Spiritual Israel, book of Revelation. And what do we have? Deliverance out of Babylon into the new earth. And so that's it, the new Jerusalem, the new earth. Fantastic. And so this deliverance out of Babylon is the bowl section, and this is the last visions in chapter 19, 1 through 22, 5. So that's a good summary, of what we've covered. Yep. Okay, so you're getting the big picture stuff now. Now, how did deliverance take place? It took place by the 10 plagues. I'm just going to go really quick through this because it's in your notes full. On what page is it there? 6. Page 6. Is it 6? 5. Page 5. Okay. First plague, waters of the Nile turned to blood, fish die, and the Egyptians could not drink it. And you got the same kind of picture we'll see later when we get into chapter 16. We'll do the comparisons. Then comes the second plague on Egypt. Frogs cover the land. And then the third plague on Egypt is gnats, insects, which begin to irritate and annoy both man and beast. And then under the fourth plague, you get great swarms of flies. But I want you to notice something here. With the fourth one, God makes it clear that this is going to take place throughout all the land of Egypt, but not on his people. You got that? So the plagues of deliverance don't fall or touch God's people. So that's why when the 7 plagues are falling, we're dancing in the trees, in the forests, because we're not going to be touched by it. Just as God protected the woman in the wilderness, providing food and water, he's going to do exactly the same for his people during the war on the remnant. Though the world will close its gates and say no buying or selling, no food, no commerce, no living, God will be providing. God will be providing. I'll put a division between my people and your people, between his people and the Egyptians. And we see this in a number of them. It's in your notes. And then we come to the 5th plague, Exodus 9. All the livestock died. And then it goes on and says, but none of the livestock of the children of Israel died. So same distinction. This is under the 5th plague. And under the 6th plague, sores on man and beast in verse 10. We're going quickly through this, but we've got the key point is this one up here. We're going to see deliverance. They're released as a result of the plagues. Hail and fire, very heavy hail, struck down everything that was in the field and all the land of Egypt, and the hail broke every plant of the field and broke every tree of the field. But then it says, only in the land of Goshen, where the people of Israel were, there's no what? No hail. So when we're reading about the plagues in Revelation chapter 16, falling, boom, 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 all 7 of them, you've got to keep this in mind, that they're not on God's people. They're being done for God's people, not on God's people. They're being done for deliverance and the release of God's people, this spiritual Israel, release from Babylon the Great. Wow, this is fantastic, I reckon. The 8th one, locusts. 9th one. Oh, this is good. Notice this one. Darkness over the land of Egypt, a darkness to be felt. And it's so dark, they did not what? See one another. They didn't see one another.
So we still see each other.
Well, they didn't, but no, it goes on. Yeah, because what does it say here? In the next part of verse 23, all the people of Israel had light where they lived. Wow. Now remember Ellen White talks about right at the end when this darkness covers and then you see these small groups of people worshipping God and light. In that dense darkness, you've got that small group of people. Hey, this is where it's rooted. It's rooted in the Exodus experience. Okay. And then we come to the 10th plague with the striking down of the firstborn. And now we come to the big story. What did the people in Egypt do? The Egyptians were urgent with the people to send them out of the land in haste. They'd had enough. For they said, we shall be dead. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls being bound in their cloaks on their shoulders, and they take off. And they come to the Red Sea. And the Egyptians change their mind and start to follow. Hey, he's a slow learner, this guy in charge of Egypt. And so he comes to the end, and they're right there by the borders of the Red Sea. They're standing on this side of the Red Sea, the Egyptian side of the Red Sea, and their way is blocked. And then Moses stretches out his hand. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and made the sea dry land. And the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being walled up to them on their right hand and on their left. And the Egyptians pursued and went in after them. And so here, God's people now are fleeing through. What's created the situation? The plagues have led to their release. Chased out. Now, true, the Egyptians changed their mind, but notice now, as they have got to the other side, the Egyptians pursued and went in after them in the midst of the sea. And what happened? All Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen, the whole army of Egypt got into the waters. Stupid people. So Moses stretched his head over the sea, and what happened to the sea? It returned to its normal course when the morning appeared, and the Egyptians had fled into it. The Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea, and the waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen and all of the host of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. So here you've got what? The deliverance of God's people, yeah, and the destruction of their enemies. Aha, does that ring a bell? Yeah, of course it does. Good on you. And so here we've got it. 10 plagues in Exodus, flight out of Egypt, and the Egyptians are destroyed. God's people are delivered. And spiritual Israel, we've got the 7 bowls. 7 bowls. And that leads to the destruction of Babylon. And the other side of it will be the deliverance of God's people. And so you're getting the parallels all the way through. Now, last point, second last point. What does Moses do on the other side of the Red Sea? He sings the song of Moses. And notice what it celebrates. This is in your notes. I've just coloured in some parts. It celebrates God as a man of war, God in warfare, who's triumphed gloriously. And who's he triumphed over? He's thrown into the sea, the horse and its rider, he's thrown into the sea the Egyptians. So it's a celebration of his victory over the Egyptians, yeah? So the song of Moses in Revelation is a song of God's victory over Babylon and its armies, the destruction of their armies. Okay, now I want you to notice that in the song of Moses, he pictures the destruction of the Egyptians in two ways. He uses two similes. He says, Pharaoh's chariots and his host he cast into the sea, he sunk into the Red Sea, and what did they do? They went down into the depths like a stone. And so like a stone sinking, that's the first one. And that fits the historical context. But then he'll come back to this in verse 9, and he'll talk about like lead, sinking like lead. We'll see that in a minute. And so you've got this idea of being cast into the sea and sinking down like a stone. But the second picture in verse 7, he says, you send out your fury, it consumes them like what? What's stubble? Dry grass, burning, because you've got the imagery of burning like stubble, yeah? So the destruction of Egypt's being pictured like a stone cast into the sea and like stubble burning. That's okay. And there's the lead one stuck into the sea. And then the rest is the song of praise because God has destroyed them. He's brought them out. And now what's he going to do? He's going to bring them in and plant them on your own mountain. Hey, and in Revelation chapter 15, they're singing the song of Moses beside a sea mingled with fire, a Red Sea. See, it's Exodus imagery, yeah? And what are they celebrating? Where are they? They're before the throne. He's brought them in. He's already brought them in and planted them on his own mountain in his own presence. So he's brought them out, destroyed the Egyptians. And so this is the Exodus, almost finished. This is the Exodus of national Israel from Egypt. You've got this diagram. National Israel enslaved in Egypt, Exodus 1 to 6. The 10 plagues are poured out on Egypt, 7 to 12. Yeah? And then we move on and we get the destruction of the Egyptian army in Exodus 14, 21 to 28. We got that? Yep. And then in the Song of Moses, it's likened to a stone sinking, and it's also likened to stubble burning. Okay, I'm making these points for a purpose. And the other side of this is, it's a song of deliverance, because where are the children of Israel? They're now on the other side. They're out of Egypt. They've been delivered out of Egypt. So it's a song of deliverance. And then they celebrate. Moses stands beside a sea, the Red Sea, and sings the song of Moses in Exodus chapter 15. And so there's the flow from slavery through the plagues, which lead to the deliverance of Egypt, escape of Egypt, and the destruction of the army, which is likened to a stone sinking and likened to stubble burning. Got that? Yep. And this is now Moses standing beside a sea, which is the Red Sea, and singing his song of praise. Now, let's look at the next one. In Revelation 15:2, he sees a sea of glass mingled with fire, and those who conquered the beast in its image. And so we've dealt with this already. This spiritual Israel standing beside a sea of glass, which appeared to be red with fire. and those who conquered. So here are the delivered ones. They've come out. And verse 3, they're singing 2 songs out of Moses. I've dealt with Moses. I may touch on the song of the Lamb later because there's Exodus imagery associated with Jesus in it, but we'll just get this one straight. Okay, so praising God. Sorry, I haven't coordinated this. I did it in a hurry in the middle of the night. Great and amazing are your deeds. Who will not fear you? This is a song in Exodus. I want you to notice this. Fear, glorify. All nations will come and what? Worship. Fear God, give glory to Him, and worship Him. See, this is reflecting the first angel's message. Here's the connection between the first angel's message and the bowl section of Revelation. Exactly the same order. Okay, so here's the allusions. 7 angels given 7 bowls containing the 7 last plagues that bring wrath of God to completion. In chapter 15, this is the first and the last vision, yeah? In chapter 15. Okay? And then 7 plagues are poured out on Babylon and its worshippers. We get that in Revelation chapter 16, 1 to 12. And what does it do? 7th bowl, it pours on Babylon the Great that splits into 3 parts. Yeah, remember this? Great earthquake, splits into 3 parts. And now notice this in chapter 18, the destruction of Babylon is pictured as a city burning. You got that? Yep. And what happened in the Song of Moses? Like stubble, exactly. Thank you. This is alluding back to the Song of Moses. So this is tied in with that sanctuary vision. And now, secondly, Babylon, a millstone sinking to rise no more in chapter 18, 20 to 23. And so here, what? A stone sinking to rise no more. So these are 2 references back to the Song of Moses. So what happened to physical Israel, God is going to be doing parallel on spiritual Babylon. We okay? And then what comes finally? The redeemed stand beside a sea of glass mingled with fire, sing the song of Moses and the Lamb. So here's the redeemed. And that's your central vision. You got this? So the first visions in
Revelation 15:24.
Sorry, it should be Revelation 15. My apologies. I didn't change it. I will change it. So Revelation 15. And so how does it relate to this is the first group? They're preparing for, being prepared for the pouring out of the plagues, which will result in them standing beside a sea, mingled with fire, and singing the song of Moses and the Lamb. So in Revelation, the angels become the instruments for the pouring out of the 7 last plagues, which result in the destruction of Babylon and the redemption of God's people. So we've seen big picture stuff here in Revelation. But it starts to make more sense, doesn't it? Yeah, it's no longer bits and pieces, but now you're beginning to see the flow of the story, which is the important thing, because sometimes when we're studying Revelation, we get stuck in a verse and we spend all that time digging around in one verse and we fail to see how it all connects together. And so for us, Revelation is a book that brings us hope and encouragement. Because as God did for national Israel, Revelation saying He's going to do for spiritual Israel as well. And so this is the destiny of God's church in the last days. Yeah, this is the remnant's destiny, is to go through this and their exodus from Babylon and deliverance into the new heavens and new earth will be an experience that parallels the experience of national Israel when it was delivered out of Egypt. All right, let's bow our heads for prayer. Father, we just want to thank you for the light that you're throwing onto us on Revelation and for the encouragement and the hope that it gives us each one. We thank you, Lord, that you're a God who cares for us, who loves us, and who seeks only our redemption and not our destruction. And we pray during this week we might learn to trust you more, because we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.